There will be no success in this industry unless we drive down the price of food, and it will absolutely happen with technology.
Today we're joined by Rini Greenfield of Rethink Food to talk about the future of food. Rini, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Matt. I'm excited to be here.
So we're talking about the future of food, and I love with your venture capital firm, Rethink Food, you talk about how we invest in the entrepreneurs who are helping build the future of food. So before we talk about the future of food, let's talk about you. Tell us quickly your background and then how you got into the food space and investing in the entrepreneurs building the future of food.
I got into the food space rather randomly, I would say.
As often happens.
As often happens in career paths. I spent my career investing in technology, disruptive technologies in the public markets and private markets. And in that process, I went through the incredible efficiencies that are driven through digitization. During, the 15th or so year of my career, I started to realize there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in the private markets, much more so than the public markets, because there is an unlock in innovation that has happened through venture capital and private equity funding. And I went to a very large family office to invest in privates, and there we had an impact lens. And I met with many, many, many impact funds who came by and pitched us their fund, and they would all start with this bar chart of greenhouse gas emissions and gloss over the bottom 30% that came from the food system and start with vehicles and energy, but no one addressed food. And I started to ask why, and it was because food was complicated, food did not have incredible exits, but nobody had a great reason. It was almost like, it's just too big a problem. I'm not going to address it. But if you want to solve climate change, you cannot ignore what is a third of the problem. It just won't happen. So that was really the inspiration I had to start Rethink Food. But together we're kind of bringing that incredible operating expertise and supporting this next generation of entrepreneurs in food that are trying to redesign the system, which is in desperate need of being redesigned. Yeah. It needs to be decarbonated. It needs to be digitized to have that efficiency and go through that transition that we saw so many other industries go through. And we need to do other meaningful things like improve access to nutrition. This food system that we have today is excellent at distributing calories.
Right.
But it is terrible at distributing nutrition. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about launching Rethink Foods. So when did you launch it, sort of the size of the fund, and then give us a sense of the companies you're investing in.
So we launched Rethink Food at the beginning of last year, so January 2022. And we're raising still a $100 million fund, investing in early stage food and ag tech companies. And we're investing in companies that are really digital or technology first. So within the world of food and agriculture, but always with a computational front end. One of the companies that we invested in early on is called Grow Intelligence. And Grow, I would describe as the Bloomberg of agriculture and climate. In order to drive efficiencies, if you are Kraft Heinz and you're thinking about your supply chain for mac and cheese, you need to be able to look out 10 years and say, this is what's changing because of climate change. If there is 1 degree of warming, then my supply chain is impacted here, here, and here by this. Yields will increase or decrease. The risk of pests will increase or decrease. The risk of disaster will increase or decrease. And I need to be able to make changes accordingly. But I can't move my supply chain on a dime. I need real long-term visibility. If you were Morgan Stanley and thinking about giving agricultural loan or being able to hedge climate bets, you didn't have the data to do this before Grow Intelligence.
Okay, So you talked about the need to decarbonize, you talked about the need to digitize, and you talked about the need for greater access to food because we have enormous food insecurity. Does that sort of capture what it is, the problems we need to solve for, or how should we think about this?
The two big problems are what you just mentioned. It is access to nutrition, which is tied deeply into health and healthcare. If you think about the cost of food, food costs more than it earns as an industry because of the health-related damage that we do to our body due to the food we eat and due to the climate impact of food. Digitization is a way in which we can drive the efficiencies to be able to do it. We need to feed 2 billion more people, right, by 2050.
By 2050, 2 billion more people, okay.
1.9 to 2 billion more people.
And meanwhile, do it in a way that doesn't contribute to warming of the planet, because of course we need to hit net zero by 2050 or sooner.
Or sooner.
Yeah. How do we feed people today, and how do we need to feed people in the future?
So the way we feed people today is through industrial agriculture, both animal agriculture and plant agriculture. The biggest problem in terms of climate is actually animal agriculture.
Right.
And you hear about it all the time. You need to eat less meat, and there are big companies trying to solve this very, very big problem. The 2 billion more people that we need to feed actually require 100% increase in our protein. They will drive demand for protein to double because it is largely a rise in the emerging markets. In order to feed that many more people the protein that they need, we need to start creating protein in different ways. We cannot grow the soy to feed the cows that ultimately are slaughtered to feed us. It's just too long a process. It requires too much land, too much carbon. So there are primarily 3 paths in which we're going to get this protein.
Okay.
One is through plants. So there are wonderful plant-based options. But in order to really transition the flexitarian, who is willing to eat...
The flexitarian
The flexitarian is someone who wants to eat anything, plants or meat. They're open to both. It's like the modern version of an omnivore.
Got it,
right?
yeah.
If you want to feed the flexitarian, you have to really come up with solutions that do not compromise on taste, on texture, on price. So how do we solve those problems? There's another path, which is called synthetic biology. So we're actually taking microorganisms like yeast and E. coli and growing these proteins in that. It sounds really far-fetched, but it is something we've been doing for decades. We use yeast to brew beer. It's the same type of process. You're brewing up meat.
Yeah. So protein through synthetic biology.
Yes. And that we grow in big tanks, like beer. And then the third and the most novel solution is a total biomimic, and that is called cultured meat. And that is us growing meat cells in bioreactors. So this is the evolution of tissue engineering, which comes from the biotechnology world, but applying it to meat. And that can be the ultimate perfect solution if we can scale that to be at cost parity.
Are you making bets on all 3, or do you actually have a thesis that one is where you're placing your money?
That's a great question. I think all 3 have a home.
Right.
So we're starting to see companies enter in the plant-based world that are the next generation of Boca burgers that are mycelium-based. And mycelium is mushroom.
Okay.
So mushroom can be an incredible way to make plant-based food. In fact, we're invested in a company that is making high-impact ingredients to make plant-based foods more basically delicious.
Right.
And nutritious.
Flavor has to be there, right?
Right.
And nutritious.
Through synthetic biology. So this will be, the future of ingredients, and it's called Motif Foodworks.
This is the company.
This is the company that we've invested in, that we think will be a platform solution to enable all the companies to be able to make delicious plant-based solutions through synthetic biology. And then we're also invested in a company that is making cultured meat called O-Meat in California, and it's a team of outstanding scientists born out of tissue engineering that are making real meat without the slaughter.
So as we think about vegetables and all that, I mean, here in Miami, we have a startup called Imagine Farms, which is trying to reduce the farm to essentially part of a city block and growing lettuce and greens. As you're thinking about the future of food, is that part of it? Is the massive sort of agricultural farm ultimately going to go away?
I think agriculture is going to look very, very different in the future. Our thesis is that instead of having that hub and spoke model that we have today, those big, big mega farms where you grow everything there and then you spend a week transporting it to someplace where you've lost a week of the food's life, it is more likely to perish in your home in process on the retail shelf because it's only good for another week. We're going to have, like Imagine Farms, these metro adjacent greenhouses.
Wow.
I think we'll see major metropolises with the areas kind of right around it, surrounded by greenhouses, where we'll grow our fresh food, and then it will be transported to the market or directly to the home in a matter of hours.
Wow.
And then you will have 2 to 3 weeks of life in your food, and the nutritional value parallels the lifetime of the food. So it is most nutritious upon being harvested.
In all these models, the carbon footprint is much smaller, addressing all the issues around climate warming gases and all that. Now, as it relates to access, is the thinking in with all of these innovations you're talking about, will that bring costs down to create greater access?
Matt, we have to address food insecurity through price. There will be no success in this industry unless we drive down the price of food, and it will absolutely happen with technology. So these greenhouses need to be automated. They need to have AI and software running them. They need to have robotics growing the food, harvesting the food, so that it is highly, highly efficient. The way farms are now, 60% of costs come from labor and inputs. We over-input, and farm labor is really tough work. It is unhealthy for farm laborers. So we need to change that. We need to take that massive problem and nip it at the bud. So automation really reduces the labor needs, and by using data and machine vision, we'll be able to manage inputs so that we can be extremely precise and get incredible outputs. So we'll take that 60% of cost and hopefully reduce it in half.
So as we think about this future, as you mentioned, California has been sort of so dominant in the food science and ag tech space and the food tech space. But are other places beginning to emerge?
Well, in agriculture, the lead is really owned by the Scandinavians.
Okay.
Because they don't grow very much food there, right? Greenhouses were something that they were always excellent at. I think we can bring that technology here. In fact, we can do much more than that. We can take the biotech side of agriculture, which is biological inputs to improve upon the chemical inputs that we are using today, and really test them and grow them here in Miami, because we have incredible land and we have incredible agriculture. If we can do that, we'll be able to come up with some of the most novel technologies for replacing ugly pesticides and fertilizers that are much better for the soil and the plants, but also much cheaper.
So as we think about the Miami of 2040, what do you hope to see?
By the time my kids are entering the workforce here in Miami, I would love to see access to all sorts of different animal proteins in different ways. So we are no longer in a situation where animal agriculture is 14% of greenhouse gas emissions, which it is today. The other thing I'd like to see is reduction in food waste. A third of food gets wasted because of all of those problems we were talking about with transport, because we're living in a city surrounded by greenhouses and surrounded by agriculture that is highly productive. Rather than feeding the animals that we're slaughtering, it's feeding us. I think that biotech and the bio revolution is the next phase in energy transition. And nobody has a lock on that yet. And it could be here.
Rini Greenfield, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.